be accurate in some way or another doesn't mean that somebody else might find it distasteful and call you racist for that reason. So you need an abundance of caution, not ignoring the diversity in the world, but being sensitive to it and being careful not to do anything that could possibly create problems, especially online. You know, we used to worry about being sued. I don't think something like this could lead to a lawsuit, but the sad reality is that problems on social media, a Twitter storm, can ultimately today be far more damaging more quickly than a lawsuit. So get the sensitivity read. Even if you don't think there's an issue, there might be something out there that you're just not aware of, a stereotype you don't know about, or something you're not sensitive to. That's why you get other people to give input, on your book. So this is a time you need to do it and make sure something like this doesn't happen to you. My interview this time is with Jennifer Lynn Barnes, a highly successful young adult author. Her most recent book, just came out last November, is Deadly Little Scandals. I asked her, what makes a really successful young adult book? And how might you expand the audience so that it's not just being read by young adults? Here's what she had to say. Jen, thanks for being back on the podcast.
Oh, I'm so glad to be back.
In addition to all the other amazing things you have done in your relatively short life, relative to mine anyway, you've published 18 young adult books. What makes a good young adult book?
I think one of the reasons that people are drawn to a young adult genre in the first place, and something a young adult book needs to cover, is I think it's a genre that is really about a time in life when you're becoming who you're going to be. You know, we always in fiction want to see transformation of the main character, but the level of transformation you can have in a young adult novel is just off the charts because you're not who you're going to be as an adult yet. Right. And in a sense, I think that all of the best young adult novels of any genre are origin stories. Mm-hmm. They are, whatever genre you're writing, the equivalent of the superhero origin story. They sort of have something that resembles that pacing. It's a story of telling how you became this person. We used to call that the coming of age story or fancier names, but you're saying it a little differently. It's almost more like the becoming story than the maturation story. Right. So it's, because it's not just that it's that coming of age moment, which makes it sound like it's, just a natural thing that everyone goes through, and maybe it is. But if you're writing a young adult novel about it, you're writing, you picked that specific novel and that specific character for a reason. And it really is oftentimes the story of that person becoming who they're going to be. And you pick that person because who they're going to be is interesting or important or resonant in some way. And we call these young adult novels because the protagonist is typically, probably always, a young adult, but that's not necessarily a definition of the readers, right? Right. So a majority of my readers actually are adults. And I have everyone, I think the youngest readers I routinely hear from are about 10 years old, and the oldest are in their 80s. So it's a really wide age range of things. Do you have a sense of what makes that? I mean, we know in some cases Twilight was obviously read perhaps by more adults than teenagers, and Hunger Game broke out. What's the appeal for older readers? I mean, I think there's a lot of different appeals. One thing is that the young adult genre traditionally hasn't been as subject to genre boundaries as traditional adult fiction was. Like if you look, walk into a bookstore 10 years ago, there was a young adult shelf. Right. And you didn't have to worry if you were writing a mystery or a thriller or a romance or supernatural. You could sort of cross those genre boundaries. One of the wonderful things about it, too, is when you're writing YA, even though you're going to have lots of adult readers, you also know that you're going to have young readers, and you might be their very first experience with a certain kind of book. So, Twilight was a lot of people's very first time reading vampires.
Right.
Right. I wrote a series called The Naturals, which is about an FBI think tank that uses teenagers to profile serial killers. It was basically the result of when I wrote my dissertation for my PhD in psychology. I did nothing but read historical romance novels, write my dissertation, and watch police procedurals on Netflix. I watched like 7 seasons of Bones and 9 of NCIS and 5 of Criminal Minds. And I'm a YA author at heart. So I thought, I'd make this great, more teenagers. And then I just wanted to write that kind of thing, but with teenagers. And I knew in writing that I would be a lot of people's first police procedural they ever read. A lot of teenagers will come to that never having read anything like that before.
So to them, it's a great new idea.
So to them, it's great and new and fresh, but it also means that you're writing it as if your audience has never read that before. And I think even when you're writing for adults, writing as if your audience hasn't read that genre before does bring an interesting perspective.
Well, you did bring an interesting perspective, though. You hear editors all the time talk about, I'm looking for the same but different. Thanks, that's helpful. But you really did deliver the same but different there. I mean, here's a young adult, and yet it's also a crime story, and it's young people working with the FBI. I don't know if that's ever happened in real life, but whatever, it's happening in your story.
Right. And, there are lots of YA books out there. I've read several I like where you have teens working with the FBI. Some of them are paranormal, and I wanted to write something that had no magical elements. But the other thing that was really important to me to capture is my favorite thing, and the reason that while I was dissertationing, I was also watching all of these police procedurals, was the idea of the team as family. I also, I study the psychology of fandom, and one thing that fiction offers us that's really powerful is belonging. Like you can imagine yourself as part of the story. So you can imagine yourself becoming part of that team. And I really wanted to create that in the young adult space. I wanted, the team of teenagers working together that felt like a family. And since they were young adult, that also meant like, okay, well, where are their families? What are their parents like? What's brought them to this program? And it sort of evolved into this idea that they all had traumatic backstories. And part of the reason they all have traumatic backstories, that in this series, they're all what I call naturals. But it's sort of a misnomer. So natural is like the 1 in a billion at some aspect of reading other people. So one of them is an emotion reader. One of them is a deception detector. My main character is a natural profiler. So she immediately understands things about people's personalities based on their immediate behavior. And she can predict future behavior. And one of them is a statistician and so on. And they're called naturals because they haven't had any formal training. But it became clear to me as I was writing that the reason they all kind of needed traumatic backstories was that they're all people who would have maybe been, 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million anyway. But to get to the 1 in a billion point at this, they needed basically to develop whatever skill they have as a survival mechanism in the environment in which they grew up. So, you have this thing and you've got these teenagers. I think it's very powerful because then you can, childhood was so recent for them. Those childhood traumas that, leave lasting impacts on all of us were 5 years ago for that. They all I actually wrote a novella that came out at the end of the series called 12 because they'd all had very formative experiences at the age of 12. And so it had sort of the flashbacks to that and new natural and all of that kind of stuff. But I think that is something that YA offers, is that you're so close to childhood and you're also still having those experiences that will be really formative for the rest of your life.
Well, you can see where that would be immediately appealing to many, if not all, young adults. And I know there are other readers, but still, it's not only triumphing over whatever adversity they face, but finding this surrogate family.
Right. And so they all feel like they've never really belonged anywhere until they belong with each other.
Right. I mean, everybody, it's not just kids. Isn't that sort of the formula of most successful sitcoms?
Right. That's what we want. We want a place to belong. Right. I mean, it's why there was a sitcom called Friends, right?
Exactly.
Like, it's a tight-knit friend group or a family or a secret society or a club. There's a scholar named Shira Gabriel who's done some really awesome work on fiction and the need to belong. And the idea that it really does seem to, give us something, a collective to assimilate
I mean, if anything, it may become more profound or more intense when people are older and you're in your job and you're busy, and you don't see your friends every day all the time. You don't have that.
Yeah, you're speaking my language. I have a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old right now, right? So I don't see other people as much as I used to, and you're still longing not just for friends, but for that group. The place and people with whom you belong. And that's something I always try in all of my books now, to make sure there is a group. So my November release this year is called Little White Lies. And it's about a girl who grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, raised by a single mom. And she's never really been able to count on or rely on anyone, doesn't have many close relationships. And the book starts when her very wealthy, estranged, very Southern grandmother sort of comes and finds her and bribes her into doing a debutante year. Basically, grandma will pay for college and then some if she moves in with her for 9 months and does a debutante year.
High stakes.
Yes.
Okay.
So she agrees, but only because she wants to figure out which one of the high society guys is her biological father, because her mom got pregnant during her debutante year. So the evolutionary psychologist in me says we're wired to care about paternity. So that's why the mystery is who's her dad. So she gets involved with the debutantes. She meets all these other kids her age, knowing that any one of them could be her half sibling. But there's a tight-knit group. She starts out as an outsider, but it's about the outsider finding her group and finding her people. And it's an unlikely place because she doesn't expect to form friendships with any of these debutantes. But at the same time, the readers kind of know there's going to be a group because the book opens with 4 debutantes in a jail cell on the night of their debutante ball. And they've obviously been up to something. So it's flash forwards with this rookie police officer trying to interview them and then flashing back. So you know that there's this group that she's sort of becoming a part of. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that, I'm really called to include in all of my books, because I feel like I'm a person who didn't find my people in the place where I belonged until college and until I became a writer and other things. Like I had great college friends and writers, and I found my people, but I didn't really have that in high school. Like I had friends, but I didn't ever have a group with whom I felt completely comfortable in my own skin. And I know that a lot of my teen readers feel like that. And I know that a lot of my adult readers feel like that because not all adults have found their people in their group yet. So I love to write books that offer that to people. Now,
and here I'm probably being too much of the writing instructor, but I'm thinking, okay, you've got a core group, and yet somebody needs to be the protagonist, don't they? I mean, maybe on a sitcom, it can be 6 friends sitting down at the coffee house, but a book needs to have a lead character. How do you make that work?
Well, I write first-person books, so I always have a designated protagonist. It's usually the person who's joining the group in that moment, because I think for readers, it helps to have a proxy to see that this is a group that's still accepting new people, because then you can also imagine, yes, like Cassie and the Naturals or Sawyer and Little White Lies, they just joined the group, which means that I, too, could then
the reader
join the group. So since I've written only one book that was third person and had multiple narrators. Everything else is straight first person. The Naturals, I also do second person point of view from the killer. It's interstitial, so it's like you pick up the knife, you drag it across the
second person.
Yeah,
you meant it literally.
Yeah, I mean literally second person.
Wow.
So that I don't have to say he or
How
she
did that
or
work
I.
out?
It's really creepy, and they're the only sections of my books that never have to be revised, which I don't know what that says about me, that like I can write the killer sections and I don't have to touch them, and then everything else gets revised.
And no complaints from audience that, this was weird and hard to
it's in fact the opening page of the book is a serial killer perspective from you, and it's kind of one of the little creepy ones. It's in part because when the main character Cassie profiles, she's taught to profile not saying he or she because it keeps her too distant from the person she's profiling. They say you or I. And there's 2 profilers in the program. The other one, Dean, is the son of a serial killer. So he's a natural at sort of understanding dark impulses, but he can't necessarily do it for normal people. Whereas Cassie's just a profiler in general. And so Cassie profiles using you and Dean profiles using I. And she often will profile the victim instead of the unsub. But that way, so you see the you passages all along, but you don't realize why it's in second person until they teach Cassie to profile. And you realize when she's talking to the killer is always you.
Do you have any sense of where young adult may be going? I mean, we've been through vampires, as we've talked about, and had a lot of that. And we've had a lot of post-apocalyptic, dystopian, this and that. We've had, paranormal suspense is like its own